Welcome to the David Spisak Show, and I want to thank you so much for joining. I'm hesitating here because this is different for me. You know, typically I have the opportunity every single week to interview some great innovators in the retail automotive industry. I have the opportunity to have conversations with some of the leading thought leaders across our industry and some of the top dealers. And today I get to do something I really don't get to do, and that is to continue a conversation with somebody who I believe is not just a innovator, but he's also a thought leader. And it's not just in the retail automotive space within the U.S., it's on a global scale. Now, why does that matter? It matters a ton, as it turns out, because as you've undoubtedly seen and noticed, this is becoming very much a global game, a global scenario in retail automotive. Literally every manufacturer, we have Japanese manufacturers that are building, in some cases, more cars here. In some cases, they're importing or creating more domestically built vehicles than some of the domestic manufacturers who are actually some of the biggest importers or exporters of vehicles into the United States. So everything's changed. The world is going a little topsy-turvy, and there's no place in the industry that has caused more conversation, consternation, hypothecation than when it comes to EVs. And the person I have the benefit and the good fortune of having back on the show today is Mr. Michael Dunne from Dunne Insights. Michael, welcome back.
So great to be with you again, David. Looking forward to this conversation.
Last time was just a bucket of fun. And for everybody who's joining, if you didn't hear part one, that's okay. Take the time to listen in. But if you did listen to part one, this is a continuation of that conversation. Why are we doing this? Because frankly, it is such a big topic. I believe it is one of the most consequential topics and conversations that you may listen to all year. And it's not because of me, but it's because of the depth of knowledge that Michael possesses. So Michael, I want to start with this. You know, you recently had an article that you wrote that just had a title to that article that I think for a lot of people in our industry, myself included, could literally knock us off our feet. What does the world look like if China was building literally every new car in the world? And is that, in your mind, is that a preposterous thesis or assertion?
When we step back and look at the big picture, David, all of a sudden we realize we're stepping into completely new territory. Never in the history of the automobile has one nation, China, possessed such powerful tools. It's an automotive machine, the likes of which we haven't seen before. So some of the numbers. China last year built 30 million cars. That's 3 times as many as were built in the United States. They exported 5 million. That's number one in the world. They have the supply chains. They dominate in batteries. They dominate when it comes to cost, when it comes to scale. This makes the previous shocks that came out of Japan and Korea look like child's play. And to make things even more dramatic, here in the United States, we're largely, let's just say, insulated up until now to this China shock that's inevitably coming. And we're only recently, this year, becoming aware of the real powerful challenge coming out of China. Last week, President Biden announced 100% tariffs on cars made in China coming to the United States. There's good reason for him and his staff to do that. We need to brace for new realities where China's number one, China's in charge, has the production capability, has the competitiveness, and is coming after Western automakers. That's the new reality we're looking at.
So, I mean, you couldn't open with a more dramatic number of statements than what you just did. And can I unpeel that onion a little bit, or kind of just allow me, for the benefit of the people listening, to delve into that? Number one, how in the heck did we get here? It's just like, it's, you know, sometimes you hear about things in the news where, you know, there's a hacker, right, some brilliant person who hacked into the system, and every precaution was taken, and there was redundancies, and there was two-factor authentication, and they just They just happen to have the tools, the knowledge, and the wisdom, and the experience and expertise to still be able to break through. This isn't the case here. This isn't like somebody, scoped out a bank for a year and a half and figured out the exact moment on the exact day that they could get into the exact entrance and be able to walk away with $10 million. This is like somebody left the bank open, opened the vault, and had a welcome sign above the vault. Isn't it?
Had spare keys in case they didn't have, if they confronted a lock, they could, hey, by the way.
It had an Uber waiting for him. Had an Uber black SUV waiting for him. I mean, how in the heck did this happen? Was it just a complete lack of foresight or oversight? And it's not just the United States, is it? I mean, the EU is the same, for God's sakes. Japan, you may say, is the same thing. Korea. So it's not just the U.S. We just happen to be the biggest market, which is likely to have to be the most impacted. So what would you say to those things?
So for a long time, the narrative in China was the Chinese consumers loved global brands. The Buicks, sensationally popular in China for years. Mercedes and BMW, Toyota, Honda. Chinese consumers preferred global brands over Chinese brands every single time. That was through the 2000s and most of the 2010s. But what changed things was that Xi Jinping, the chairman of everything in China, and his lieutenants 10 years ago said, enough of us playing second fiddle to the West. We must find a way, China. We're the largest market, largest producer of vehicles. We should lead in next generation technology. So he's got this thing called Made in China 2025, a blueprint for supremacy in next generation tech. That's chips, that's AI, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and batteries. And they began throwing billions of dollars behind that initiative, launched in 2015. What made a big difference is that for the global automakers on the ground, they had gotten so accustomed to being number one in China, they couldn't imagine a different reality. It's complacency, if you will, but they had years of winning in China. There's no indication that things would change. The second thing was that the Chinese, when they moved to electrics, were able to immediately tap into a vast number of global tier one suppliers, your Lears, your Denzos, your Bosches, who had set up dozens of plants in China. So it wasn't a case that we have to start from scratch. We already have the industrial supply chains in place. We just have to shift to a battery-powered vehicle with a Chinese brand name. And that's exactly what happened. That's number one, David. And then briefly, number two, for most of the last 25 years, up until very recently, China stayed home. They didn't export to global markets. In 2020, they exported about 1 million vehicles, 5% of the total production. That's jumped up to 5 million last year, 6 million this year. So we're just at the leading edge of China saying, we're now dominating at home and we're going global. This is all happening at rapid speed. And everyone's trying to, like a boxer in the ring, saying, boy, I just got clocked with something I didn't see coming. I better regain my balance here and figure out what the hell to do. That's where we are.
So is it fair to say that the powers that be, whoever was involved during those periods of time, perhaps massively underestimated China as a powerhouse, a prospective powerhouse when it comes to automotive? Is it possible that... Oh, go ahead.
Yes, I think that's a great description. Massively underestimated. There was always in the back of their mind that, well, there's an ambition of the Chinese to duplicate what Japan did and Korea did in terms of success in automotive. But after a couple of decades, they thought, these guys are never going to get there. They just won't get there. It won't happen. This is a different story.
Is it
true?
Is it also, Michael, is it also possible, I mean, maybe this was fueled by it, but that from the West, so whether it was the UK, the European market, the United States market, that for years, I mean, let's be honest, there's one of the reasons China wasn't exporting cars was there wasn't a single car they made that could pass the test with NHTSA over here that would get approved and that perhaps we're sitting over here scoffing at the vehicles, that they just almost clowning these guys at the lack of quality of these vehicles, and basically took our eyes off the ball for a few years, because today quality is not a question over there. And then the other question I had for you is, if you would, maybe perhaps because we massively underestimated not just them, but because we were a little late to the party. When Elon started down the path where he was able to validate that people indeed would buy an EV if it was compelling in terms of technology, in terms of build, in terms of design, in terms of performance. And it's almost like China instantly said, okay, almost like that Wayne Gretzky quote, I'm going to skate to where the puck's going, not to where the puck is. Well, it's almost like in the U.S., we're staring at the puck where it's sitting. And the meanwhile, they said, I think we're going to go check out Africa and maybe, I don't know, give them a little bit of money and go dominate, do a complete grab on minerals, so that they now own 85% of the battery production, 92% of refining, and they own the majority, I think well over 80% cobalt, lithium, nickel. So it almost like it doesn't matter if we find a mine here and there, because first of all, it's going to take 5 years to get it up and running. Secondly, you're still going to send it over there to refine it.
Processing.
So so it just seems like we not only underestimated them, but we took our eyes off the ball. We were late to the party on seeing EVs coming down the path. We weren't paying attention to what was happening over there with on the supply chain. And at this point, I'm struggling to understand, honestly, what any OEM is thinking, even going into the EV market. Because how do you go into something when you cannot control the supply chain and you cannot control the cost that's involved? Is that fair?
Right. We're going into a war where they have all the weapons and we have only an aspiration to one day have comparable weapons. It feels a little bit like, this goes way back in history, but remember Sputnik being such a shock to the U.S. when the Soviets launched that sound. So it's the same thing happening today, except that we're not responding in the same way. There isn't the same sense of urgency. There's a crisis here. We better figure things out quickly. It's more like, well, we don't see Chinese cars on the road yet in the United States. And by the way, we're making record profits on our large trucks and SUVs. So what's the matter? That's still, even today, with all the numbers that China presents us with and the challenges, we're still wondering, like, is there a workaround here? Can we hold the Chinese off through tariffs? So, but back to your initial point, was there this? Yes, the Chinese came over to the United States, and I call it the boy who cried wolf, because through the 2000 and 2010s, they'd come to the auto shows and they'd show these underwhelming vehicles that didn't pass any kind of test. Nobody desired them. And they'd say, well, we're coming in next year. Oh, but then the year after that, then make it. And one time after another, they declared plans to come in, and then they did a U-turn. So it's understandable in the way that we discounted their ambition, but it's no longer a question. They're now exporting to more than 100 markets worldwide, hundreds of thousands of cars into the European Union, including the UK. They're in Mexico. I was just in Mexico 10 days ago, David. There's more than 20 Chinese brands in Mexico right now. BYD there launched their new pickup truck. SAIC MG is there. Not many people know this. You mentioned quality. Half of Tesla's global production is today in China, and half of that is exported from China to markets worldwide. So if you're ever wondering, like, well, is this just a low-cost, cheap Chinese car play? Forget that. They've leapt up so that their quality and technology is on par with what we have here in the West, and their costs are lower. So it's real.
So let's go to the next step. So we,
yes,
in the process of underestimating them, and in the background here, we scoff at them year after year. Understandably, they had terrible products that were showing up at NADA or in different events around the United States. And to your point, boy, they cried wolf, nothing ever showed up. So, you made a really big point in that, it's funny when you don't see any of the products here, it's almost understandable that people don't take it seriously. Mm-hmm. And, I oftentimes mention this quote by the great Scott Galloway, marketing professor at NYU, that goes something like, it's amazing how long things take and shocking how quickly they happen. It seems like that's so appropriate for what's going to happen the day that the Chinese EVs show up here, because it's not going to show up with a drip. I mean, these guys, it's almost like the Olympics are coming up in summer, and I want people to imagine that 100-meter race, and as all those, you got 7 guys that are in the blocks, or 7 women in the blocks, the 8th person is already got a head start, right? Mm-hmm. So by the time they say go, as they're trying to get up to speed, that 8th person is at full velocity, full speed. Well, I really think that's what's going to happen when it comes here. Secondly, it's kind of an interesting tug of war, because on one hand, we've got the tariffs, which I want to get into a quote about Elon Musk and ask you about that in a minute. But on one hand, you definitely have some fear, as there should be, perhaps concern. But you also have, I believe, some American dealers that have a very high level of interest in prospectively being a dealer, a franchise dealer for one or more of these Chinese brands. Because, hey, we saw Japan come in the 60s. We saw in the 80s Korea come to town. That worked out pretty well. And who wouldn't go back to the 60s now and absolutely raise their hand for a Honda or Toyota franchise? Same thing for Hyundai, perhaps, in the 80s. And so there's a lot of dealers, Michael. It seems like they have interest, while at the same time, the government, the administration is going, I'm going to do everything I can to keep these guys out of here. What's your thoughts on that? How does that get reconciled?
You're absolutely right. There's not a week that goes by that I don't hear from a dealer group in the United States, across North America, saying, tell us who the next Hyundai is. Where are they? Let us get in touch with them, because we're ready to go. So that demand and interest on the retail side is absolutely there right now. At the same time, they're looking at DC and say, wait a second, you just put the kibosh on any kind of Chinese import with 100% duty. And oh, by the way, I think Donald Trump and Joe Biden said if you try to build them in Mexico and ship them across the border no, that's not going to happen either. So the message out of DC is absolutely, it's a no-fly zone, not welcome here. The dealers at the same time are hungry to learn how can they make money with the Chinese. So maybe, depending on how elections go, we might see a scenario where there's transplants. Just like with the Japanese and the Koreans before them, you want access to the U.S. market, you need to invest here, create jobs and tax revenues for the American people. And then maybe if we're really creative, we might even take a page from China's own playbook. And that was when global automakers wanted to go into China in the 90s and 2000s, China said, fine, come on in, you can manufacture here. But, oh, by the way, you must have a joint venture partner, and that joint venture partner must be Chinese, and they must own 50% or more of the venture. Hey, if we were to do that, why not? It would be a way for our automakers to learn very quickly how to match the Chinese when it comes to things. If the decision is palatable to bring the Chinese inside our own industry. That's a big if.
No,
but you could see a transplant scenario maybe taking place.
And there's plenty of precedents for that. I mean, there's JVs that have been around. I mean, in your article, you mentioned Ford has shipped hundreds of thousands of vehicles that they built in China. GM is building vehicles that are Chinese built and shipping them to Mexico right across the border. This is not new. We've certainly seen this over previous decades as well. Now, I still think that, China, in their probably going to think in their intelligent best interest, they still control the supply chain. So you could have the JV, but you may not get the same pricing. You may not get the same availability. And so they are, in most likelihood, are going to have an advantage. The other thing, too, is that, if the dealers start leaning on Washington, and if they start leaning on Washington, do you think that from your perspective, there's a likelihood, whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration, if Trump wins in November, how likely do you think that is that, and I'm stuttering here because it's just so strange to think about dealers all going to NADA to lobby on their behalf to let the Chinese manufacturers in, because all they see is if you don't, the reality is I don't have anything viable to sell. Okay, whatever's being produced today by Ford, Stellantis, GM, or whoever else is out there, import automakers, luxury automakers, it's not viable. It's not price competitive. The majority of the country cannot go out and pay the average $1,100, $1,200 payment that it takes to have an EV. So I don't know, have you thought about that, and what does that look like? Out?
One of the things that does distinguish our current challenge from previous challenges is with the Japanese and Koreans, they were our allies and subordinate to our interests. We, United States market,
great point,
government always had leverage over their behavior. Whether it's explicit or implicit, there was leverage. This time around, there are those who say, we don't want to let the wolf into the hen house. Is that what it's the fox in the hen house? We don't want them inside. Why? Because they're not our buddy. They're our adversary. They're challenging us openly, politically, and economically around the world. So do we want to make that decision? And there's trade-offs. The consumer would say, hell yes, because we want more affordable vehicles, your point. On the other hand, national security interests are in play here. Do we want to have the Chinese as dominant manufacturers in our backyard? That's the ultimate question we're looking at right now, today.
So I'm going to shift because you mentioned the tariffs. Number one, 100% tariff on an $11,000 U.S. BYD Dolphin, by my math, is $22,000, which is still spectacularly cheaper than anything somebody could buy today. So isn't it possible, and this is before China even was to implement any government-based incentives that they chose to implement to offset the tariffs in the U.S. just for the sake of still being able to break through here, prove there's demand here, and get a foothold. True?
100% true. The Chinese, a little bit about the context inside China. There is a massive price war. Margins have been driven down to razor thin. So there's a great urgency among Chinese automakers to find new markets. And there's no more lucrative market on the planet than the United States. So the key would be get in there, get a foothold, subsidize it, sell it at a loss, take market share. That would be the strategy. At the same time, the United States government would be much more vigilant about, wait a second, what are the supply chains you're using that allow you to make those cars so cheaply? And are they legitimate? Are you sourced? Is the labor? Where's the labor being done? Is it from Xinjiang? Where's the part coming from? So it would get political in a hurry if the Chinese, even with the 100% duties, were able to deliver a car in their low 20s. That would get everyone's attention in D.C. Hey, wait a second. They're even able to, 100% duties, that's not enough to keep them out. What's going on? So where might it go? In Europe years ago, you might remember they had quotas on the Japanese and the Koreans, 7%. That's it. We'll let you in no more than 70%. Or, you know what? For the time being, we're going to have a ban on anything made in China until further notice. Maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years. But it seems clear that out of Washington, U.S. government saying, if we were allowed the Chinese to come into the market, whether through exports or manufacturing here, it would really do serious damage to the Detroit Three and the interests of the United States. So It's like two heavyweight boxers getting in the ring, David. Where is this thing going to go? Then you have the elements of the dealer saying, bring the products. My goodness, we can make fantastic profits and the customer will be so happy.
I mean, Michael, just for context, inventory is up year over year by 50%. April new car sales were down year over year by 3.3%. By my math, that's all the makings for a bad outcome for a dealership. Right now, why are those cars not selling? Well, average household income is at 77 grand. 5 years ago, pre-pandemic, it was just under 70 grand. So they've gained roughly $8,000 in gross, $500 a month in net. But let's face it, everything from eggs to milk to cell phone to insurance, gas, and chicken fingers have gone up. Some cars, Stellantis marked up their cars or increased the price of their cars 50% from 4 to 5 years ago. Toyota is the lowest one at 18 to 20%. So, it's almost like if you're a new car dealer, roughly a third of your market area can no longer afford to buy just a new car. By the way, 5 years ago, I believe we had 18 different models under 20 grand. We have 0 today. So these dealers are sitting on massive amounts of inventory, paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in floor plan interest just for the benefit of having a car they're ultimately going to sell for a negative net profit. I mean, at some point, you figure that out as a dealer and you could say, let me see, all I need is a ruler, a protractor, and some graph paper, and I could see this is going to end very badly. But, I see over here, if I had a couple of the right franchises over here and we replicate what's happening in other parts of the world, I see a pretty good future. Second point, there was a survey done fairly recently, and I'm trying to remember who did it. It was Auto Pacific. They did a research to ask what percentage of people, of course, is top of mind, what percentage of the people that they spoke to would consider purchasing a Chinese EV? Well, it was 36%. Now, while that's not the majority, that's a lot bigger number considering all the rhetoric and the narratives that are out there. It's a lot bigger number than I expected. But here's the crazy thing. When they asked that question specifically of Gen Zs, it shot up to a whopping 76%. So let me see here. The dealers see the writing on the wall. They want the cars to come in. They have an audience where we're at least 36%. I mean, let's put it in perspective. You got as many people saying they're willing to buy a Chinese car that are willing to buy an EV. and you've got twice that number that are Gen Z saying, bring it over. I want it. So
now,
what do you think there?
David, on the back of that, I'm guessing here, totally speculating, but I'm guessing that those people, the same people, would not be able to name more than 2 Chinese brands. It's just the idea of something more affordable coming out of China. Why not?
But isn't that where it's coming from?
And then and the automakers, here's where things get very interesting. Back to your original question about all cars being made in China. Stellantis now has an arrangement with a company out of China called Leapmotor.
Yep.
Leapmotor, one of the leading startups out of China in EVs. The deal is, commercial relationship is, Leapmotor, we're a 20% shareholder in you inside China, will participate in that business, but anything you export from China will carry a Stellantis brand name, not Leapmotor. And you can very easily see the ambition, Carlos Tavares is clear about it, to use China as a manufacturing base for electric vehicles for the world. So your Fiats and your Dodges and everything else, maybe even Jeeps, would be built in China, electrified, but carry a Stellantis brand. That's good for China and possibly good for consumers around the world, but isn't it sort of just hollowing out our own manufacturing capability? And Stellantis isn't the only one.
Isn't that the antithesis of what everybody's talking about, whether it's political or otherwise, that we want to bring manufacturing back here? But we not only let them or, just by virtue of not being focused on that, it allowed them to be able to own the supply chain, own the minerals, own the refining, own the 85% of the batteries. But now we're actually wittingly, willfully making them the center of the world when it comes to manufacturing and production.
Yes.
So, yes. And here's another thing when it comes to tariffs. This is something I just personally struggle with. If you look at the amount of goods that are in the United States on an annual basis that were imported from China, hey, I'm not going to buy. 40% of Americans said, by the way, 36% overall said we're going to buy. 40% said, I won't buy any product from China. And yet, $500 billion in product, $500 billion. So guys, go and do your math. Go see how much total product was sold last year. $500 billion of that came from China. 5,000 Chinese-owned companies exist in the United States, and China owns, I think, close to $500 million. No, let me see. They have 500,000 acres, I want to say, of farmland. So yes. I don't know. Isn't the toothpaste out of the tube when you hear they're going to put tariffs on an $11,000 or $20,000 car? When you already you're buying $500 billion of product you're importing. They own a ton of farmland, and they've got 5,000 Chinese-based businesses here. Like, am I wrong, or does all that seem like it doesn't make sense?
They're already here. They're at every level of our leading universities, major donors, billions of dollars over the years to the Harvard, the Ivy League schools, to the major state schools nationwide. Those contributions, the Chinese never give something for nothing. So, as you said, there's 5,000 Chinese companies. There's more than 100 Chinese automotive companies quietly already established in the United States, concentrated in California for the technology and Michigan for manufacturing. So they're essentially here. I think the United States must come to the conclusion, to the reality check that China's number one when it comes to automotive. Number one. They're the king of the hill. They're in charge. Now, how do we respond as the underdog or the challenger? How do we cope with this new reality where we no longer are able to dictate the pace or direction of things? It's 100 years of history saying, oh, that's just changed. Okay, now what? That's where we are right now.
I almost equate it to a defense system that the government bought that it was tuned to make sure that you notify the White House immediately within 30 days after we've been invaded.
All right.
Right? I mean, it's like, are you kidding? You know, I also heard Elon Musk was recently interviewed, and this was fascinating to me, and I want to get your take on it. What he said is that he is staunchly against Chinese tariffs. Now, to anybody out there listening, boy, wouldn't you think that would not be in his intelligent best interest if they did have tariffs that would protect Tesla sales here? But he said, listen, we compete just fine in China without tariffs, incentives. And so he is against Chinese tariffs, and he is also against incentives for both oil and gas cars as well as EVs. What's your take on his statement?
Elon never disappoints. He's always provocative, right? So a couple of things occurred to me right away. One was half of Tesla's global production today is centered in China. One of every two vehicles built by Tesla. Even though it's an American company, most vehicles the company makes are built there. Two, Tesla exports half of that production to markets globally. So if the United States puts in place tariffs and EU follows and other countries also do that, that would hurt his export business from China. Third, and probably most closest to the truth, he says, let things fly, let the chips fall where they may. We're ready to compete. On the other hand, Ford, GM, Stellantis, and others, you may not be around. You may not be around, and those are the breaks. Let's have it out. That's my read on it, because I didn't expect. Just months earlier, he had said, without tariffs, the Chinese will demolish several Western automakers. And by implication, you thought, well, that's why he'll probably endorse tariffs. But here we are today saying, no, tariffs are okay. I'm sorry, no tariffs are the way to go. Yeah, you never know what Elon's going to say next.
You know, one other thing that just occurred to me too, and listen, I never claim to have perfect recollection, but it's typically pretty solid considering my advanced age here. You know, it was only a number of months ago, it seems to me maybe 6 or 8 months, where there is news that came out that the U.S. government was considering a $500 million loan to VinFast. Do you remember that? And the $500 million loan, interesting, it was for it was an economic loan, and VinFast would be able to use that to build a factory in Vietnam. So help me out. It's okay to give $500 million to a Vietnamese-owned company to build a factory in Vietnam that's going to benefit them and create Vietnamese jobs. Good for them. But yet now we sit here 6 months later, same administration, saying, no, we got to clamp down. I mean, doesn't it reek to me? It reeks a bit of, I don't know what you say, theater or posturing to put himself in a position for the upcoming election, knowing very well what Trump's stance is with regards to China's EVs. How do you take that?
So I'm not aware whether the loan was to support a factory in Vietnam, which they already have, or maybe a new one in North Carolina. That was so that the idea would be, let's manufacture in North Carolina and start something right here at home. But more importantly, I think that the significance of that move was we are looking for allies and leverage to offset this powerhouse called China. And if you look around the world, arguably no other country is better set up than Vietnam to do so. It's got 100 million people. They're extremely competitive people. They are the new darling of investment for companies that are looking to manufacture for export globally. We've seen a huge increase in investments into Vietnam. So U.S. sees Vietnam as sort of a buddy in the region to counter this beast called China. It's realpolitik. Those are our new friends to offset the challenge from China.
So interesting. The article, I looked it up, is from relatively, I would believe, reliable source. It's Vietnam Plus, which is a Vietnam newspaper, but the article originated out of the U.S., and it says the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
The DFC had signed a letter of intent with VinFast for a $500 million loan for expansion. Now, if you look further down, it says the signing took place on the sidelines of the 28th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Dubai. And the loan is going to be used to support VinFast's establishment of lithium-ion battery manufacturing facilities in Vietnam.
In Vietnam. Okay,
Yeah.
That's remarkable and probably further testimony to this strategic narrative of, hey, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, you're our offset to this thing called China. We want you to be a strong partner, an alternative to what's coming out of China. But I had not known that, and that's highly significant.
Right.
That
The optics are kind of interesting at this point with what's been coming out of the administration lately. And by the way, you've heard no fanfare. You haven't heard of anything strategic. That doesn't exist unless you dig into the weeds to get that information. So I wanted to get your take on that. So, Michael, the most provocative thing about your article, and there were many things, for anybody, by the way, if you go to davidspisak.com, you can get directly from there part 1 and part 2 of this conversation, but you could also learn how to get in contact with Michael, how to follow him on LinkedIn, how to subscribe to his newsletter, which he puts out just absolutely fascinating information. And you will be able to find this particular article. But the bottom line of that article is what really hit me is they currently already have the ability to produce 50% of the new cars in the world globally, and they will be they'll have the ability by 2030 perhaps to be able to handle 75%. So that's just, guys, it's just 5.5, 6 years from now, 5.5 years from now, they could prospectively handle 75% of the world's production. By the way, with our help, because we're helping to make them the center of the production universe. It's a staggering thought.
That's a great
Michael.
point, Dave. We are helping them to make them the center of the production universe.
Yeah, it's like you're giving a small business administration loan to NVIDIA.
All right.
To bring chips here. So, I mean,
what can we do to help you?
You know what I mean? It's just like we definitely missed on that one too, right? Because very quietly, Taiwan has been producing these, high quality chips for over 25 years. And now, again, the administration, hey, we're going to create this program. We're going to start building a factory. All right, great. We'll see you in 5 years. By then, the chips that you're building will be obsolete. And then we'll have to figure it out again. So I don't know. It almost seems to me like the administration is a bit grasping at straws, being very reactionary, in some ways desperate, and in some ways posturing again for the upcoming election. It just, something about it just doesn't ring true, especially when you consider all of the other facts.
The election is definitely a factor. One other thing, having lived in China for as long as I did, David, just to give you a sense from the inside out, it is a different society, a different culture, a different way of organizing things in this thing called state capitalism, where they select certain industries, they pour massive amounts of billions of dollars in other resources and subsidies to say, we will be the global champion in this business, and we're not making any apologies about it. We will dominate global, we'll be the manufacturer of cars for the world, and no one's going to tell us differently. So in a market capitalist society like the United States or the West, we say, well, there's always going to be a level playing field and we'll compete and the best company win. Here, it's kind of two different systems, state capitalism against market capitalism. And at least at this point, the state capitalism looks like the more muscular boxer. And how do we respond? Well, you need to level the playing field. Why? What for, China says? This is working out perfectly for us. We're not going to change anything. It's you guys who need to step up your game. So this is new. When I said new, completely new territory, it isn't like Japan or Korea or the Germans when they came to the United States before. This is a country that's, in Xi Jinping's own words, it's time for China to take center stage. Only once in 150 years do we have this opportunity. Now it's come, and we are going to seize it and not apologize to anyone about it. So, we have this collision of two different systems, and we're trying to figure out how to counterattack this new beast called China.
Yeah, almost seemingly by design, you have these two powerful systems, and as you called out, the state system being the more powerful of the two, but we have to deal with both sides of that. And it seems a little bit analogous, China does at this point to me with Amazon. And here's what I mean. I can't remember when it was, but geez, it was near the early days of Amazon that somebody had mentioned to me that you should type in www.relentless.com. Mm-hmm. And when you type that in to this day, for anybody listening right now, if you have your phone, your laptop, type in www.relentless.com. Guess what pops up? Amazon's homepage. And, because they're Jeff Bezos and company's intentions was not to compete, but rather to dominate. And it wasn't to dominate in one industry. It was to dominate every industry. And perhaps China, based on what you had written in your article and based on the reality of everything that you're sharing, the facts, perhaps they are the global relentless.com at this point, because their intention, as you said, is to dominate. One of the facts that you brought up in your article, Michael, was they already own 90% of the solar industry. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. More than 90% of solar panels are produced in China. They have a monopoly there. David, as we enter the summer period, everyone's going on holiday. I highly encourage people to travel to, I don't know, Spain, UK, Thailand, Mexico, Brazil. They'll immediately get a sense of, whoa, what are all the Chinese cars on the road that we've never seen here in America? They're popping up in markets worldwide. So nothing more powerful than seeing is believing, and that's a recommendation for the summer.
I love that. I'm going to be heading over there soon. By the way, just one last thought, one last question for you. When you see that Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Netherlands making the moves that they're making, I believe even perhaps in the EU, to move away from incentives to help promote people acquiring EVs. What does that mean on that stage? When you talk about, Norway was north of 70% EV adoption because basically the government was helping you buy one. Amsterdam, same thing. And there was an article out of that area, probably a better part of 9 months ago, that the government officials were basically saying, I don't think we thought this through. I think we overdid it, because what they found was people were moving away from using public transportation. Everybody were going out and buying EVs, and they justified that was a much more efficient way to travel, and they started moving away from public transportation, which had obviously a financial implications for the government. It also had implications when it came to traffic and congestion, so in terms of quality of life. But, Germany eliminated them. Switzerland said, we're out. So what does that mean to the future in your mind at the end of all of this, Michael? Mm-hmm. There are many, I would say, in the United States that would maybe not say that EVs are dead, but that is severely wounded, diminished, discounting it. Is this a business that is actually on its heels, that's wounded and is likely to go off sulk off into the sunset? Or is this more of a pause, regroup, reset, and figure out where do we go from here, but EVs aren't going anywhere?
I feel like it's a pause or a reset because China's not slowing down. The EVs are largest market in the world. EVs are now 40% of new sales. Europe, to your point, has slowed. The U.S. has definitely slowed the growth. But one thing to keep in mind, if the future, as a lot of smart people say, is critical minerals feeding batteries to power not just cars, but also a lot of our military equipment and capabilities, then we as a nation really must develop our own independent supply chains around those, from critical minerals to processing to the cell manufacturing and so on. Without that, should we enter into conflict in the future, we'll be severely handicapped in our ability to compete and win in war. So that's some real, even though consumers may not want EVs today, we may not be able to dictate the future. There's this other guy on the other side of the Pacific called China that has become the standard for the world. Oh, this is new, hard to get our minds around as Americans. We don't want EVs, but maybe we don't have a choice. Maybe we need to step up and compete, even when it's not apparent that we're not going to win in the short term, but longer term, it's in our national interest to be competitive in this space, because without it, eventually China's exporting to everywhere else in the world. Electrics become the new standard, and we look like we're in the museum watching, kind of like, whoa, history's taking place and we're just bystanders. No, we don't want that.
By the way, whoever said we need to do this to free ourselves from the grips of OPEC.
Right?
You want to rethink that?
Can we go back?
Anybody have a time machine? Oh, so, man.
To your point, David, I think let's just be smart as Americans. So leverage. Okay, let's try to leverage the electric future so we're not totally dependent on OPEC. We're not totally dependent on the Chinese. Let's find our third way and get there gradually on our terms to the extent possible. And that seems like a practical way forward, not racing to go to electrics because that's racing into the arms of what the Chinese would like to
Exactly.
see. But not ignoring it either because it will be part of our future competitiveness as a nation.
I couldn't agree with you more. Michael, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, if there's a dealership group, a state association that represents dealers, or anybody else that wants to reach out, connect, hire you to speak, or hire you to advise them on something having to do with EVs, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Easiest way is DunneInsights.com. That's the website. You can find the newsletter, our podcast, and all the information about our services are there. Or if you want to write me directly, it's Michael@DunneInsights.com.
Wonderful. I cannot thank you enough. This has been absolutely one of my favorite conversations. And as I said at the outset, I think it may be one of the most impactful, influential conversations in retail automotive that I've heard myself anywhere. And that's all thanks to you, thanks to your knowledge and your insights. Dunne Insights, by the way, might as well throw that plug in there. But I just want to thank you for taking the time for joining me. I really appreciate it.
David, appreciate it. First class conversation every time.
Thank you so much. For everybody listening, thank you for taking the time to be a first class audience and taking the time to listen and to learn from Michael. If you would, please take the time to share. I oftentimes say, listen, if this is of interest to you or you think somebody else would be interested, please share it out. I promise you, 99% of anybody in retail automotive is going to want to hear what Michael shared this week and last week. So please do share it out. Would love to get your reviews, good, bad, or ugly. I like them all. And please take the time to subscribe or download. And I will see you next time on the David Spisak Show. Thanks so much.